The studio lights burned hot, but the air in the room felt colder than winter steel. Colonel Douglas McGregor sat forward in his chair, his jaw locked, his eyes hard. The host's voice wavered slightly as she repeated the question: was Putin bluffing? McGregor didn't blink. His answer came like the crack of a rifle: no. He's not bluffing. The Russians are already aiming their missiles. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the production crew seemed frozen in place, the sound of paper shuffling and keyboards clicking replaced by an eerie stillness. McGregor leaned closer to the microphone, his tone dropping to something grim, intimate, like a man trying to make you understand that the fire isn't in the distance, it's already at the door. He spoke of reconnaissance photos, satellite imagery, intercepted communications. The evidence was there, plain and undeniable. Strategic missile forces had been repositioned, new targeting coordinates fed into their systems. This wasn't training. This was preparation. At home, millions of viewers felt the same cold knot form in their stomachs. In living rooms, kitchens, and bars, people stopped mid-sentence to stare at the screen. In one small apartment in Warsaw, a mother gripped the remote so hard her knuckles went white. In Berlin, a retired army engineer reached for his phone to call his old comrades, his heart pounding as if he were back in uniform. And somewhere in London, an MP in the middle of a dinner party excused himself to make a call he'd been dreading for weeks. McGregor described it clinically, but his words carried a weight that no graphics or charts could soften. Russian missile crews had shifted into what military planners called final readiness posture. That meant the warheads were loaded. The guidance systems were active. And the coordinates? They weren't random test points in Siberia. They were Western capitals. Across Europe, governments took notice quickly. Within hours, secure conference lines hummed with urgent voices. Defense ministers and intelligence chiefs scrambled to assess the credibility of the report, but deep down, most already knew McGregor's words were simply confirming their worst fears. In Brussels, NATO's war room lit up with activity. Analysts pored over radar sweeps and satellite transmissions, looking for patterns, anomalies, anything. The night shift officers could feel it in their bones: something was coming. The Kremlin made no official comment, but Russian state TV's late-night segment featured grainy footage of missile convoys moving through snowy landscapes, soldiers in heavy coats overseeing the operation. The anchors spoke in calm, deliberate tones, but the message was clear: the motherland was ready. The second wave of unease swept across the continent the next morning, when the European Space Agency released new images to Allied intelligence. The photographs didn't just show missile repositioning. They revealed the movement of mobile launchers to areas previously thought unsuitable for deployment. The Russians had adapted their logistics to the winter terrain, an unmistakable sign of operational readiness. In Paris, the French defense minister convened an emergency cabinet meeting, speaking in hushed tones about the probability of tactical demonstrations in contested zones. In Madrid, the Prime Minister ordered the Civil Guard to quietly update evacuation protocols, though nothing was said to the public. Officially, it was still business as usual. Unofficially, people knew better. Panic buying began quietly, almost imperceptibly: first batteries and bottled water, then fuel, then canned food. The shelves in some Eastern European cities started to thin. Those old enough to remember the Cold War began checking their basements for the dusty remains of old bomb shelters. By the third day after McGregor's warning, the streets of Warsaw, Vilnius, and Bucharest had a new undercurrent of tension. People still went to work, still picked up their children from school, still stopped for coffee. But their eyes wandered more to the skies. Every passing jet drew an extra second of attention. Every unexpected sound made shoulders tense. And somewhere in Moscow, behind the thick walls of a secure command center, coordinates glowed on a large digital map, each one representing a place where millions of people lived, worked, and slept, unaware of just how close the world was to a tipping point. In Washington, the glow of monitors painted the Pentagon's war room in shades of green and red. Screens scrolled with real-time telemetry, satellite images, and intercepted bursts of encrypted data. The room buzzed not with panic, but with a controlled urgency that carried its own kind of dread. At the head of the long table sat the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his hand tapping a slow rhythm against a manila folder. Inside were intelligence briefs stamped classified, eyes only. The president's security team filed in, their faces grim. A secure video link connected them with NATO's Supreme Allied Commander in Brussels, his voice cutting through static. "We're seeing full-spectrum readiness from their missile units. This isn't posturing. This is operational." The arguments began immediately. One faction, led by hardliners in the administration, insisted that a firm response was the only language Moscow understood. They called for immediate strategic bomber flights along Russia's periphery, the rapid deployment of additional missile defense systems to Eastern Europe, and a public statement promising devastating consequences for any strike. Another group, quieter but no less determined, warned that any aggressive move risked triggering exactly the war they were trying to prevent. The president listened, hands clasped under his chin, eyes fixed on the screen where McGregor's broadcast from 3 days earlier now played on loop in the background. Every word felt heavier now. Every image more urgent. In the corners of the room, aides whispered updates from field stations. Somewhere in Alaska, radar operators had reported brief but unexplained blips, possible hypersonic missile tests, or perhaps just atmospheric anomalies. No one could say for sure. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, Russian submarines began to vanish. It started with one Abore-class ballistic missile sub, its last known position somewhere in the Barents Sea. Then another, and another. By the end of the week, 4 nuclear-armed submarines had disappeared from tracking grids entirely. They hadn't gone silent, they had slipped into the deep Atlantic, where detection was nearly impossible. At NATO's undersea monitoring facility in Norway, technicians stared at sonar charts, searching for the faint patterns of propeller signatures. But the ocean was vast, and the Russians knew how to hide. Every missing submarine meant 16 nuclear warheads, each capable of leveling a city. In a dim operations room beneath Whitehall, British naval intelligence compiled the data into a single report. It was grim. The submarines' probable destinations were not random, they aligned with patterns designed to threaten both sides of the Atlantic simultaneously. London, New York, Washington, Boston, all within theoretical strike range. Then came the leak. At 2:14 a.m. Brussels time, an anonymous group of hackers released a series of encrypted files on a dark web forum known for military whistleblowers. The files contained fragments of communications between Russian military command and an operation codenamed Day Zero. The language was sparse but clear enough to cause alarm, references to synchronized launches, electromagnetic pulse bursts, and final timers set to a date and time redacted in most of the messages. Within hours, intelligence agencies were scrambling not only to verify the authenticity of the leak but to contain its spread. By dawn, however, screenshots of the messages had already begun circulating on social media, complete with amateur translations and wild theories. Hashtags like #Day0 and #MissileCrisis trend across Europe and North America. In Moscow, officials dismissed the files as Western propaganda. In Washington, no one was so sure. And in a small NATO command center in Romania, an air raid siren was tested for the first time in nearly a decade. It was just a drill, the officers said. But the sound, long, hollow, and unbroken, made the soldiers stationed there glance up at the sky, as if expecting to see the flash before they heard it. Snow fell in thick, lazy spirals over Red Square, but the mood inside the Kremlin was anything but serene. The massive double doors of the presidential briefing room closed with a dull thud, sealing out the noise of the city. Inside, generals, intelligence chiefs, and ministers sat in rigid rows. At the head of the long mahogany table, Vladimir Putin adjusted his notes, then looked up directly at the cameras broadcasting to every corner of Russia. His voice was measured, calm, almost grandfatherly in tone, but the words cut like steel. Russia does not seek war. But if our red lines are crossed, we will act. Swiftly. Decisively. And without hesitation. The red lines were never defined, yet everyone knew what they meant: Ukraine, NATO expansion, and Western interference in territories Moscow considered its sphere. State television rolled footage to match his speech: missile crews in white camouflage uniforms moving through forests, their breath steaming in the cold air. Warheads were hoisted by cranes and locked into launch tubes. Long, olive-green transporter erector launchers rolled across icy roads toward positions deep in the wilderness. The anchors spoke softly, almost reverently, about readiness and defensive measures, but the imagery told the real story: these weapons weren't being hidden. They were being shown. In the West, news networks ran the same footage, but with a different tone: ominous music, urgent graphics, experts pointing at maps with grim expressions. In Paris, Berlin, and Ottawa, foreign ministers issued statements calling for de-escalation even as their militaries quietly activated contingency plans. The public watched with a mix of disbelief and growing fear. That fear took root most deeply among ordinary people. In Warsaw, posters appeared overnight with instructions on how to find the nearest bomb shelter. In Riga, old Cold War-era sirens were dusted off and tested. In Finland, a popular YouTube survival channel released a video titled "What to Do in the First Hour of a Nuclear Strike." It reached 2 million views in less than a day. By the end of the week, the sense of looming danger had seeped into daily life. Trains were fuller, but quieter. Cafes stayed open, but customers kept glancing at their phones. And in apartment buildings across Eastern Europe, parents began packing just-in-case bags: bottled water, canned food, flashlights, batteries, and family documents. The anxiety was not limited to Eastern Europe. In Chicago, a group of high school students staged a walkout, holding signs that read "No World War III." In Tokyo, the stock market trembled at the whispers of global instability. Even in Sydney, thousands of miles away, local radio hosts asked military analysts the same question everyone else was thinking: are we really on the brink? Back in Ukraine, where the possibility of conflict had been a grim backdrop for years, people braced for the worst. Border towns saw an influx of soldiers and equipment. Local officials quietly distributed iodine tablets, officially as a precautionary measure. In one small town outside Kharkiv, an old man stood in his garden, watching a column of tanks pass down the road. He didn't wave, didn't smile, just stood still, as if trying to measure the distance between himself and the future. Meanwhile, in the Pentagon's European command bunker, analysts noticed something subtle but alarming. Russian missile units had stopped rotating their positions as frequently as before. This wasn't normal. Constant movement was part of their standard operating procedure to avoid detection. The lack of movement suggested something chilling: they were no longer hiding. They were getting ready. In the early hours of a freezing Monday morning, sirens wailed across several cities in Poland, Lithuania, and Estonia. Officials insisted it was a scheduled test, but to anyone who heard the sound echoing through the dark streets, it felt like a countdown. The Black Sea was restless, churning under a low, lead-colored sky. On the horizon, the silhouettes of warships moved like predators: Russian vessels to the east, NATO ships to the west, each tracking the other with unwavering precision. The water between them was empty, but the air was thick with tension, every radar ping and every radio transmission carrying the weight of possible war. Aboard the USS Roosevelt, a U.S. Navy destroyer, the crew moved with quiet efficiency. The captain stood on the bridge, eyes fixed on the Russian frigate that had been shadowing them for days. Every so often, a pair of Russian Su-30 fighters would scream overhead, banking low enough for their markings to be visible before peeling away in a show of force. The NATO fleet mirrored the Russians' movements: every maneuver countered, every signal answered. In the Combat Information Center, operators tracked the closest contacts on glowing screens. One wrong move, one misinterpreted signal, and the sea could erupt in an instant. The tension wasn't limited to the Black Sea. In the Baltic, similar standoffs played out. Fighter jets made aggressive passes. Electronic warfare systems buzzed and crackled, jamming communications. Both sides tested the other's resolve, inching closer to a line that had no clear marker until it was crossed. In Brussels, NATO headquarters pulsed with activity. Diplomats shuttled between closed-door sessions, attempting to keep the military pressure in check. But in Moscow, the rhetoric only hardened. State television warned viewers to prepare for any contingency. Across the Atlantic, Washington's tone was equally grim, no longer speaking of possibilities but of rapid response requirements. And then, without warning, something happened. At 3:27 local time, a Russian missile battery near Kaliningrad lit up NATO early warning radars. Operators in Germany and Poland watched as the telltale launch signatures appeared. For 90 seconds, no one could confirm whether it was a drill, a misfire, or the beginning of the unthinkable. The missiles never left the ground, but the message was clear: the distance between peace and catastrophe had narrowed to a hair's breadth. In Kiev, President Volodymyr Zelensky held an emergency address, urging calm while demanding stronger commitments from NATO. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the strain. He knew as well as anyone that once missiles began to fly, speeches would no longer matter. Meanwhile, Colonel McGregor appeared on television once again. His voice was grave, almost resigned. "We are at the brink," he said. We're minutes from the point of no return. The pieces are in place, the orders are ready. All it will take is one spark. That spark nearly came the next evening. Somewhere over the Norwegian Sea, a Russian Tu-95 bomber strayed too close to NATO airspace. British Typhoon fighters were scrambled in response, intercepting the massive aircraft in a high-speed, high-altitude dance that lasted less than 6 minutes. Both sides pulled back, but the encounter sent a shockwave through command centers on both continents. By midnight, the world seemed to hold its breath. In New York, traffic slowed as news tickers flashed with urgent updates. In Berlin, church bells rang scheduled, but in that moment, they sounded like a warning. In Moscow, military convoys moved through the streets under the cover of darkness. And deep inside Russia, in a fortified bunker, a large digital clock counted down. To what, no one outside that room could say. But the hands of the clock kept moving forward. Somewhere, a phone rang in the White House Situation Room. An aide picked it up, listened, and nodded grimly. "Mr. President," he said, "it's happening." The screens lit up. Radar signatures flared. And the world stood on the edge, staring into the abyss.